would tariff protection be the best way of dealing with these problems? Now, here there are, the answer is no, in my view, very clearly, but I think we have to say why, and I will separate out the two dimensions of the problem. Imposing tariff protection does not of itself solve balance of payments deficits. Trade deficit, there are complexities here in how you deal with GDP accounts, and I'm going to ignore those for the purposes of this discussion. Doesn't really make huge difference. But basically, if you run a huge current account deficit, that means that spending in your economy exceeds output in your economy. That's true by definition. So when you're running a current account deficit, it means that the spending of residents, well, more or less, the spending of residents exceeds national income, okay? And that creates a deficit. It's just another way of saying you've got excess spending. Do tariffs affect this? No, not. They only affect it to the extent that tariff revenue leads to a reduction in the fiscal deficit. So there is an effect there, but it's not huge. Ultimately, you have to, and of course you could generate revenue in other ways. But ultimately, spending and income have to be brought closer together if you want to reduce your current account deficit. So the main impact of the tariff is that it shifts the composition of the sectors of your economy producing tradable goods and services. This is quite complicated, but broadly speaking, if you raise tariffs, you will shrink your imports, you will increase the size of your import competing sector, but in the process of shrinking the size of your import competing sector, you will certainly shrink your exporting sector. And you can see this directly and indirectly. I can't go through all the mechanisms because it takes a while. But essentially what happens is, so your import competing, relatively less competitive sector grows. The exporting sector is adversely affected by the shift in the exchange rate, which will tend to appreciate once you reduce imports.
Yeah, and the dollar has fallen.
The dollar's falling is I think a temporary process. In the long run, the real exchange rate will appreciate, and it will because you simply need less imports. That's not true overnight. That's true over several years. And of course, in addition, the inputs that exports use, much of which is manufacturers, will cost more because you've got huge tariffs on them. And that will shrink your export competing sectors, which use tradable inputs. So the net effect, I think, will be overwhelmingly not to reduce the current account deficit. As I pointed out in one column, if you look across the world, countries with very high protection often run huge current account deficits. They're not affected by protection because you have to adjust income and expenditure. But you will change the composition of your tradable goods and services sector in the direction of the less competitive parts, because that's what import competing firms are. Firms that are competing with imports tend to be less competitive than the firms that are overwhelmingly competitive in exports, because they are, by definition, really competitive. So you shift the production of your tradable goods and services sector towards less competitive sectors. You don't increase them overall. And while you might increase to some extent employment in your manufacturing sector, it will be offset by losses elsewhere in agriculture, in services, and in parts of your exporting sector. So if you have a problem like this, you need to rebalance demand and spending in your economy, which in the case of the US means worldwide. I'll come to how you will do that later on. But tariffs on their own will not fix this problem. We know that. We've known that as economists for half a century or more, actually, much longer. Then the final question is, let's suppose you wanted Still, you do want to use tariffs, so you want them to be effective in order to get people to invest in import competing industry. Let's assume you ignore everything I said for, you want to do that. Then what you have to do is impose tariffs, do them in a sensible way. We can discuss what that would look like. It wouldn't look like individual tariffs against every country in the world. They would be overall, because you don't want to create lots of distortions in relative prices between the imports coming from every single country in the world. I just think how complicated it would be to work out, well, who's going to be supplying me with this good? Is it going to come from Germany, or is it going to come from Japan? They're all going to have different tariffs in the Trump formulation, which is really ridiculous. You just want a uniform tariff, and you want it to stay. So the standard way of doing this would be to impose a uniform tariff, probably. There are some qualifications to that. And you then say, well, this is the tariff in the next 15 years. And then you decide to invest. None of that's has happened. So my view is it's not a reasonable objective. It's not, the tariff is not an effective instrument, and the way they're doing tariffs is a complete mess. Should they do? This is the last thing, since you asked these most fundamental of questions. What they should have done, you say, who are the countries running huge surpluses? The most important are, in fact, China, Germany, Japan. Germany and Japan are allies.
India?
No, it's relatively small. The current account surplus of India is pretty trivial. In fact, I don't think it has a current account surplus. I think it has a current account deficit. But that I haven't looked the last year or two. There are some number of smaller rich countries. Switzerland has a huge one. Singapore has a huge one. But it's very small relative to the world. It's huge relative to the economy. Only big countries really matter for this purpose. And then what you would say is, we're going to put a tax on the exports of China and of Germany, or on the capital exports, that will be even easier, of these countries into, say, the US. And we will keep that tax on the capital imports of these countries until they introduce policies designed to reduce their current account surplus. Now, that will be a targeted, clear policy. Some of my friends have argued for this. Even quite classical economists have argued for this. And that would make sense. That would be, whether it will work, whether it would change the policies of these countries, I don't know, but it would be targeted at the real problem, which is the global imbalances, I think. And then you would introduce subsidies and or very targeted protection to support the industries that you decide are really high priority. High priority for security reasons, for employment reasons, whatever they are. You would have to decide who they are, and you'd decide the priority in relationship to your policies and your priorities, not a relationship to what you think everybody else is doing. And you certainly wouldn't pay the slightest attention to bilateral balances, because there's no reason why you should have balanced trade with every country in the world. It's as absurd as expecting that you as an individual have a balanced trade with every commercial firm you deal with. Of course you don't. So the answer very simply is these are extremely bad policies, badly targeted and based on misunderstandings of the underlying problem.